Hello, my name is Olivier and I will present a laser fault injection performed on a secure memory. I will show how we managed to bypass a security feature in a complete black box approach. I'm part of the Ledger Donjon team, which is the security lab of Ledger, a hardware wallet manufacturer and blockchain service provider. Our team is dedicated in software and hardware security evaluation of blockchain and IoT devices. Today, we can find different solutions for storing secrets in embedded systems. Most of the time, microcontrollers are used. The sensitive information is directly stored inside the flash memory of the chip, which can then be locked by burning some security fuses. This is a very convenient and low-cost solution. However, it is usually not very secure, as most microcontrollers cannot withstand hardware attacks. This is the case, for example, of the STM32 devices, which are vulnerable to low-cost glitch attacks, as we saw with many publications last year. Secure elements are a much better solution. Those are security-dedicated circuits which embed countermeasures against hardware attacks. Those circuits are evaluated by laboratories to get a security certification. The code is reviewed and many tests are performed, such as fault injection or side-channel analysis. The goal is to verify the circuit can resist to a well-equipped and expert attacker. Unfortunately, access to those devices is very limited because of the non-disclosure agreements you have to sign. And most of the time, it is not possible to develop native code for those very closed platforms. Therefore, we can find a third circuit category, which are the secure memories, such as the ATECC508 from Microchip. The circuits target IoT applications. They are easily accessible, and we can buy them from any resellers and in small quantities. We wanted to know more about this circuit and assess its security level. We studied this secure memory in a real application, which is the Coldcard wallet. This is a hardware wallet for securing bitcoins and signing the transactions for the blockchain. We studied the version 2, which is now deprecated, as only the version 3 is sold today. Hopefully, this later wallet revision is not vulnerable to the attack I will describe next. This wallet embeds the STM32L4 microcontroller for the applicative software. It manages the USB communication, the keypad, the screen, and runs the cryptographic algorithms for signing the transactions. Signing a transaction requires the knowledge of a private key, which is called the seed. Here, the seed is not stored inside the microcontroller, but in the secure memory which is connected to it. Access to the seed is protected by authentication based on a PIN code. So what are the perks of using an ATECC508? To begin with, the software attack surface is reduced. The chip has little memory and exposes a limited set of commands. The firmware of the circuit is also unknown. It's a manufacturer IP and remains secret. Hence, finding software vulnerabilities is difficult and must be done in a black box approach. Then, the circuit embeds hardware security countermeasures. There are voltage glitch sensors and also a top metal shield which prevents attackers from probing the internal signals of the circuit using microscopic needles. Finally, the clock of the processor is generated internally to prevent classic clock glitching attacks. All those countermeasures are mentioned in the Microchip documentation, and we spent some time checking they are implemented. We tested the chip behavior against glitches, and we also observed the top metal shield after dekeeping the chip on the front side. Other undocumented countermeasures may exist, but when reading the datasheet, we didn't find any reference to light sensors, and so we believed this chip would be vulnerable to laser fault injection. So here comes the laser. This is our current test bench. We have a device under test, plugged onto our scaffold evaluation platform. This board sends the commands to the circuit, reads the responses, and generates accurate signals for triggering the laser. We used one laser source, which sends light pulses through an optical fiber down to the microscope objective lens to get a very thin laser beam. The microscope is mounted on a motorized stage, which is controlled by the computer to automate testing. You have to know the silicon is transparent to infrared light. This is what allows us capturing the nice pictures of circuits from backside, as we can see on the right. Also, circuits are very sensitive to light. Lighting a logic gate creates parasitic currents in the transistors and can modify the output of the gate. And if we do this during the execution of the program, we can then introduce computation errors, corrupt data, or instruction codes. Laser fault injection is a very powerful and efficient technique. On the right of the slide, we have pictures of two different circuits. The top one comes from a secure element, and we can see small white rectangles around the logic gates. Those are laser light sensors. They are based on photodiodes and raise an alarm when light is detected. The sensitivity level of the sensors is much lower than the required energy to inject a fault. The bottom picture comes from the AT-ECC508, and we cannot see such patterns. Therefore, it confirms there might not be any hardware countermeasures against fault injection, against laser light fault injection. So what is the plan? Firstly, we have to identify the sensitive assets and find an attack path to retrieve them. Here we are in a black box approach, and we absolutely don't know how the firmware works. We have to make assumptions and imagine a fault which will disrupt the circuit to bypass securities. To help this, we'll try to collect information which will help us to create an attack scenario. We will analyze the power consumption of the chip and have a look at its internal structure. Finally, we run a testing campaign. This is not the most difficult part of the job, but for sure it is the longest one. It can take many days and require patience. I am now going to detail the memory layout of the secure memory. The EEPROM memory is divided into three areas, which are the configuration, the data, and the one-time programmable area. We will focus only on the configuration and data. The data area is split into 16 files. Each file or data slot is really small and has a fixed size. The first 8 data slots have 36 bytes, the last 7 have 72 bytes, and there's one bigger data slot in the middle. Each data slot has a specific configuration which is defined in the configuration area of the memory. The configuration describes the access rights of each data slot. It is set during chip initialization and then locked permanently with a special command. There is no possible factory reset once a chip has been configured. In the Coldcard wallet case, there are 3 interesting data slots highlighted in green here. The first one is the pairing key, which is a random secret shared between the microcontroller and the secure memory. It is unique to each wallet and prevents attackers from swapping the microcontroller with another one in an evil-made scenario. Then there is the pin1 data slot. It stores the hash of the user pin code mixed with the pairing key. Finally, the seed is stored inside the seed1 data slot, which is accessible only after proving knowledge of the pin1 hash data slot through an authentication. So if an attacker manages to retrieve the content of the pairing key and pin1 hash data slot, then he'll be able to authenticate, get the seed, and get all the bitcoins. The secure memory provides the read memory command for accessing the data slots. This command is very simple. It takes the data slot number, a size, and an offset. We can read either 4 or 32 bytes. If access is granted to the data slot, the circuit will respond with the content of the data slot. If access is denied, it will only return a single byte error code. This is the configuration of the pin1 data slot. If we look closely, we can see two interesting settings. The first one is the is_secret flag, which is enabled. When this flag is set, the secure memory prevents reading the content of the data slot. It will remain secret, and this data slot can only be used for authentication. Then we have the encrypt read flag. When this setting is enabled, the content of the data slot is returned encrypted when reading the data slot. As here the data slot is marked as is_secret, we can think the encrypt read flag is not relevant at all. But if we manage to get access to the data slot with a fault injection, then we will be happy to get it in plain text and not encrypted with an unknown key. So a first idea here is to flip the is_secret flag from yes to no. The security here relies only on a single bit, which obviously does not sound very good. So how can we do this? We are still in a black box approach and we don't know how the firmware works. We can only suppose it. Here I wrote a very basic hypothetical code where I suppose the firmware will try to fetch the data slot configuration from EEPROM memory. Then it will test the is_secret flag to decide if access is granted or denied. When access is granted, the firmware will fetch the content of the data slot in the EEPROM memory, encrypt it if the encrypt read flag is set, and then return the result. If the data slot is secret, which is the case for the pairing key and the pin1 hash data slots, the other branch of the code is executed and an error code is returned instead. Best thing we can try is faulting the if test here by replacing a branch instruction with an op to change the execution flow. The problem is, once again, we are in a black box and we don't know when the instructions are executed. We don't know when we should fire the laser, and if we don't shoot at the right time, many things can happen. As an example, if we shoot too late, the circuit may not respond at all, and the script will raise a timeout error. And from the outside, as we don't have any debugger, it's very hard to understand what really happens. If we shoot too early and modify the data slot number when the configuration is fetched, the firmware may by chance test access to a data slot based on the configuration of an authorized data slot. In this case, we would be lucky and retrieve the secrets. The funny thing is, we will not really know why the attack worked. Did we faulted what we wanted, or is this a lucky side effect, an unexpectedly working attack path? It's very hard to know. So, the first big question is, when should we precisely inject the fault? To answer this question, we'll have a look at the power trace of the circuit. Here is a little schematic with a secure memory under test here, accepting commands and sending the responses on the I2C bus. Then all the electrical current of the chip goes through a measurement resistor, which converts the current into a measurable voltage. As we try to observe a very small signal, we need an amplifier to boost it before measuring it with the oscilloscope. The power consumption of a circuit is highly correlated to its processor activity, and by recording it, we can collect some important clues. Here is a power trace example captured by the oscilloscope during the execution of a read memory command on a granted data slot. The yellow trace is the data signal of the I2C bus. It conveys all the bits of the read memory command. The blue trace is the electrical current of the circuit. As soon as all the bits of the read memory command have been sent, the processing starts and the circuit requires more energy. This is reflected by a rise in the power consumption. Once the processing is over, the current returns to an idle level. The response here is not visible in the yellow trace just because the chip is slave on the bus and the response is fetched much later. If we repeat this experiment when trying to read a secret data slot, we can observe the processing stops earlier. And this is logical and it matches our previous code hypothesis. So with those two traces, we know when processing starts, we know when it stops, so we can already define a coarse time frame for the laser pulse. But this is not precise enough yet. To go further, we can average the traces to reduce the noise, and there compare them in detail. Here is the result. The red trace corresponds to denied access, and the gray trace corresponds to the granted access. We can see at the beginning of the processing, the two traces perfectly match. This means the execution flow is exactly the same in both cases. Then, at a particular time, the traces start to be very different, because the execution paths are not the same anymore. This is probably the time when the eSecret flag is tested, the time of our hypothetical conditional branch. If we continue looking at the granted access trace, we can observe after the divergence a pattern repeated 8 times. This looks like a loop. When injecting faults during this loop, we got faulty data output when reading the data slot. This way, we demonstrated this loop corresponds to the transfer of the data slot from EEPROM memory to a RAM buffer, maybe the I2C buffer. We saw that 32 bytes are copied by 4 byte words. And as we can expect, this data transfer does not occur in the denied trace. So, with all those clues, we can hope injecting a fault near the divergent time would bypass the security and grant us access to the data slot. Next big question, where should I physically lit the chip with a laser? Let's see how the ATECC508 circuit is made, and how we prepare it for laser fault injection. Here is a drawing of the circuit package, and if we hide the package epoxy, we can see the silicon inside, which is glued to the copper lit frame. Then there are bonding wires in copper or gold, which connects the inputs and outputs of the die to the package pins. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, the ATECC508 has a top metal shield. This is usually one or more tracks covering all the surface of a chip to hide what's underneath. So if we try to illuminate the chip on the front side, all the light will be blocked by the shield and won't reach the transistors, and we won't be able to inject any fault. Instead, we will illuminate the chip from the other side. For this, we will decapsulate the chip from the backside. This can be done using a precise milling machine with a small diamond tool. The package is milled until the lit frame is visible. The process can last about half an hour, require care and cleaning. Once the lit frame is visible, it can be lifted off and removed using a scalpel. Finally, the glue paste is removed gently using a small tool. Here is a real picture of a circuit decaped for backside access. As I said previously, silicon is transparent to infrared light, and if we turn on the camera of the microscope, we can see through the silicon. To give a scale, the die of the AT-ECC508 is 1.5 millimeters wide, which is small. With the camera, we can then capture high-resolution pictures of the chip. This reveals the internal structure of the circuit and helps us targeting the interesting areas. On the bottom of the chip, we can find analog circuitry. Shooting there is usually not very efficient, so we didn't investigate this area. On the top, we can discover some memories, and in particular, we have the EEPROM memory on the top left, which stores all the configuration and the data. We then have a ROM memory on its right, and this memory probably stores the firmware binary of the circuit. Finally, we have a RAM memory, and the rest of the circuit is made of interconnected logic gates, which belongs to the processor and the peripherals. Knowing what each gate does is very difficult, and it would require many months of reverse engineering, as we don't have access to the manufacturer design files. I said the laser beam is very thin thanks to the microscope objectives. It's actually the size represented on this slide by the red dot. It's easy to understand that scanning all the chip surface to find potential vulnerabilities can be very long, and reducing the search space to the most interesting areas is crucial. To target specific areas of the chip, we developed dedicated navigation software. Most of the time, we target memories first because it usually gives good results. Memories are very sensitive to fault injection, and as they carry the program data or the instruction code, there's a good chance we get very critical faults if the memories are not protected. Once the scanning zones have been defined, we can run the testing script. The software will automatically move the laser beam to a new position for each test. The laser beam displacement follows a random marching algorithm, which allows editing dynamically the search space during the testing campaign, and also stop or resume it at any time. Before starting the testing campaign, we loaded known data into the data slot we wanted to retrieve. This helps to define a stop condition in case of success. Then, for each test, the laser shooting time is configured, the laser beam is moved to the next scanning position, the circuit is powered on, an initialization sequence is sent, the laser is activated, and then the read memory command is sent with the laser shoot at the same time. The laser is deactivated, and the response is read out. Then the circuit is powered off. This is necessary in case the firmware is in a bad state or when the analog circuitry goes crazy, which is known as the latch-up effect and can be destructive if not stopped. Finally, the result and the testing parameters are all logged into a database. We'll see right after that logging the experiment properly is very important. During the testing campaign, about 1 test per second is performed. A lot of faults are injected, and many different things happen. The chip can crash and not respond to the command, so we get a timeout in the script. We can get a positive response from the chip, but with unexpected data. For example, the test number 4 returns some kind of header with a lot of following zeros. This is not what we expected, and we clearly don't know what this is. A lot of times we got random looking data. Sometimes we got undocumented error codes or successes without any data at all. You don't really know what will happen during testing before trying, and it's very important to write reliable testing scripts to catch and log all possible weird behavior. Even checking the CRC values can help. We ran a very long testing campaign which lasted many days. You usually stop when you get a success or when you get bored. And after more than 300,000 tests, we got bored. We logged more than 1,000 responses from a chip with data, but unfortunately, none of those matched the preloaded data we set at the beginning, and so we were pretty sad. However, we had the feeling we were close to succeeding, and we decided to investigate our results to understand what was happening. We sorted all the results with data in a top 20. We can see that some of the returned data were received a lot of time. As the chip is powered off and powered on for each test, this cannot be random data, and it's obviously stored somewhere in the chip. We just don't know what this is, and as it looks random, we thought it might be encrypted. We then plotted the data, what data was received over time, which is represented by this figure. The x-axis corresponds to the experiment number, and the received data are sorted on the y-axis. For instance, if we look at the first line, the data starting with A712, we can see it has been received many times during the first 100,000 tests, until a certain time. After that, we never got this result anymore. We finally understood something unexpected happened. We think at this time, the content of our data slot has been overwritten by accident, probably because of a fault. This seems to have happened many times during the whole testing campaign. We believe the generate key command of the AT-ECC had been triggered, probably with a fault by accident, during the command dispatcher. This would explain the randomness of the new data in the slots. We also observed some data seem to be related in pairs. If you remember the configuration of the data slot, maybe we faulted the encrypt read flag in some cases. So we get both plain text and encrypted data from the slot. So this looks like very good news. We believe we may have successfully read a secret data slot, but we weren't lucky enough to retrieve the content before overwriting it. So it's not a win yet, and we need to improve this setup. As a new challenge, we wanted to do it without losing the data. Using the log files, we identified optimal attack parameters. The goal is to increase the success rate as much as possible and reduce the risks of data overwrite. When we then decapsulated the circuit, another circuit, reloaded non-data, and started the experiment again with the new attack parameters. And we won. In less than 2 minutes, we managed to extract the correct data without overwriting it. We are now able to read both the pairing secret and the pin1 hash data slots, as they share the same configuration. Those two data slots allows us performing a successful authentication to access the seed and get all the bitcoins. Despite the complexity and cost of this attack, it can really pay off. Some people can protect big amounts of bitcoins in hardware wallets, and there's no possible rollback after theft. We've been many times asked if we killed chip before managing to do this attack. The answer is yes, of course. We destroyed about 10 circuits during our work, which is not that much since the samples are cheap and easily accessible. However, each time you kill a chip, you have to decapsulate another one, which takes time and quickly gets boring. We killed some chips when trying to configure them. Since the configuration of the secure memory can only be set once, Any mistake is really painful. We also killed circuits during decapsulation, especially when we tried silicon grinding and polishing to reduce the die thickness and get more light penetrating the sample. Also, we destroyed many chips due to bad data overwrite in the EEPROM memory, usually resulting in an invalid configuration which gets rejected during circuit cell test. As destructions are hardly predictable, it's difficult to take actions for preventing them. We saw that the chip is vulnerable to laser fault injection. There are many mitigations which could be implemented to ensure better security. The software can be improved to harden the product. A typical countermeasure is double-checking all the sensitive operations, so the attacker has to perform the attack twice, which is much more difficult, especially when the success rate is low. Also, we saw that the is-secret flag is encoded using only 1 bit. A well-chosen word constant might be much more difficult to corrupt to the correct value. I told you how painful it is to break a chip and prepare replacement samples. To me, the best countermeasure is implementing a kill chip. If the program detects an error during its execution, it can take actions to destroy itself permanently, by erasing its own firmware, for instance. With such behavior, an attacker may quickly give up. There are also hardware mitigations which can be added. The most efficient are laser light sensors. You get caught 99% of the time, and it's very difficult to circumvent. Noise can be added to the power consumption to make its power trace analysis much harder. The CPU clock can be randomized, which adds noise to the power trace and also reduces the success rate of the attacks, because the correct shooting time is never the same. Just imagine shooting arrows at a randomly moving target and you get the ID. The memories can be protected with error detection codes, so any corrupted data transfer can be detected. Each of the software and hardware countermeasure may be defeated by a skilled attacker. But when there are multiple of those together, it becomes very hard to hack the chip. And if any countermeasure triggers a kill chip, then it's extremely difficult. And actually, this is what secure elements do. But it's not that easy to improve the security of a chip. Implementing correctly the countermeasures is hard, and if not done correctly, security can even get worse. Furthermore, every mitigation has a cost. Software upgrades and hardware countermeasures both require more silicon area, and thus it increases the price of the circuit. It may also have an impact on performance and power. The countermeasures can also be patent protected, which can be a real problem for a chip manufacturer. Unfortunately, security is expensive. Finally, some last words about our work. We presented a difficult attack which require very expensive equipment. The cost of our test bench, including the laser station, the oscilloscope, and all the instruments, is about $200,000. However, it might be possible to reproduce this attack with cheaper equipment. In this case, the success rate may be lower, but the attack might still be rewarding. And after all, I've seen brilliant people with much more equipment in the garage than us. The vulnerability I've presented affects a very specific data slot configuration. This is not a generic attack, as opposed to what's been done with microcontrollers where all the memory can be retrieved. This is not the case here, and in particular, we didn't manage to read cryptographic keys from the data slots, which are handled differently by the secure memory. However, we demonstrated the circuit has some weaknesses against laser fault injection, and some may find attack paths to break other functionalities. We believe this circuit really lacks some countermeasures. Finally, the AT-ECC508 has been deprecated by Microchip. It can be now replaced by the backward-compatible AT-ECC608, which should be more secure. The Coldcard wallet has upgraded to this latest silicon revision, which is a very good thing. Thanks for watching this presentation, and feel free to ask questions.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. It's now time for Q&A. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. So I got only one question. Someone asked, is the vulnerability embedded by an attacker when memories are being manufactured? So I'm not sure about the real question. If the question is this backdoor inserted in a supply chain attack? The answer is no. All the devices are affected by this vulnerability depending on the configuration. So if an AT-ECC508 has a data slot with the eSecret flag and is not used for an elliptic curve key, then it will be vulnerable to this attack. This is more like a weakness of the circuit, and it's not a backdoor or a supply chain attack. So I don't know if you have more questions. As you could see, this vulnerability is hard to patch, so we had a long disclosure time with Microchip, and they actually made this circuit deprecated now, so you can buy the next revision, which should be more secure. So thanks for the feedback on the chat. I appreciate. I hope you enjoyed. And okay, another question. Does the laser permanently affect the chip or only during operation? Can it change memory or translate or transistor state? Basically, the fault injectants are transient. You can flip or correct data for a very short amount of time. This is why this is very powerful, and you can make very chirurgical faults. However, you can have permanent effects depending on the reactions of the chip. So, for instance, if you trigger some memory write in a random address, you may break the chip or have a weird behavior. Do you have plans to analyze the other secure memories? Actually, we are looking at the 608, but we didn't plan yet looking at other secure memories. As you may understand, it takes a lot of time. We had a few months of work for this, but maybe we can have a look at other memories. How many chips do you need to complete the laser fault injection? We broke less than 10 chips, so it's not a lot. And now if we want to reproduce the attack, only one chip is enough. What semiconductor geometries are susceptible to the laser fault injection attack you demonstrated? As I said, the memories are really susceptible to laser fault injection. Then basically everything that is a transistor can be faulted. But you have to spend a lot of time scanning the area of the circuit to find efficient faults. I have heard that there is AT-ECC508B version that may address this. Is this true? I don't really know. I know Microchip worked on patching the device. I don't know the state here. I can't answer this really. But if they make this silicon, I guess they will make improvements. Okay, one last question then. Why did you decap from the bottom rather than the top? It's mainly because of the top metal shield, which shadows all the light you can inject from the top, so you can't reach the transistor with the photons, and you don't have this problem on the backside. Would something similar work on a BGA package? BGA package might be a problem if you can't access the backside, but usually you can work. It will take more time, but you can always remove the bolts and try to reroute the pins if you don't have much pins. Does the laser wavelength influence the success rate? I don't know. I have only one wavelength. Okay, so thanks for your feedback and your questions. I hope you enjoyed. Don't hesitate to share the presentation or to tell people to have a look at it. Thanks.